Hello everyone and welcome to Emily vs. Art. Today I'll be showing you how I draw a generic sexy girl doing nothing because I was feeling some sort of artistic block with these videos and this seemed to be one of the easier things to pump out. We are going to start with a SenshiStock photo with her underwater. I think it's a really interesting pose, even if it is kind of a hot girl doing nothing. And so we begin with removing the background and using the liquefy tool in order to get some sort of arch in the back a little bit more, some more bust. Not that the original photo wasn't beautiful, it's just that if you're drawing for a stereotypical male audience on the internet, you need to have a certain kind of proportion to your work. And I don't think that this is how you should draw all the time, but it's not just that skinny hourglass figures with big busts and nice thick butts are visually appealing in the modern sensibility. I also think they're easier to draw for me personally. Maybe it's because of my many years of drawing female figures. Maybe it's because I am a woman and I can look in the mirror and see how a female body moves. But the curvy, soft lines of a girl are easier for me to draw than a muscled up dude bro in a comic book cover. So I start with some guidelines just over the stock photo and I copy and paste them over to start drawing my figure. And this is pretty rough. And I think what's really important when you are setting up a sexy girl doing nothing shop, you want to not only have those hourglass proportions on the main body, you also want to have delicate features on the limbs like hands, feet, face, that sort of thing. And so you can see here that the original foot that I drew kind of looked like a brick. So this isn't set in stone. I'm going to be using, tricks like the liquefy tool and warping and that sort of thing in order to get the figure that I'm looking for. I mean, look at that waspy waist that I drew. It's just not realistic. And even if you're trying to go for sexy girl doing nothing, it should still have a basis in the reality of what human anatomy looks like. I also try to kind of solidify my lines, and then I take a selection around my sketch and invert it and then fill it with a color on a multiply layer. I make the mistake here of not getting rid of my purple lines, or at least not desaturating them, because here, if I had done so, it would have been much easier later to color my final painting. I then use a brush on multiply in order to start building my shadows. Again, this is going to be really rough, just getting a general sense of value and where the light is hitting, but as you will see, there are certain areas that are just not great. So I end up having to use another guideline from the stock photo, which ends up making my original figure look a little bit pregnant, and I'm just not sure how to make it look realistic while still being, quote unquote sexy. But, that was something that was trial and error as I went along, and I'm kind of satisfied with the final product. I then move on to the hands. This is something that I tend to put off until last minute. As you can see, I left it as a bare minimum sketch until this point, which is kind of silly. Especially if you're challenged by something, you should tackle it a lot earlier on in the project so that you have time to consider different iterations and different ways of expressing something. So as you can see here, I go through 2 or 3 different poses for the hand and finally settle on something that I'm relatively happy with. However, I don't go into much detail. At this point, I create a darken layer where I use some sort of random skin tone. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing yet. I, alter the pose, and that's when I decide to start actually painting. I've pretty much been using the basic pressure opacity round brush this entire time. I figure that getting into fancier brushes doesn't really do me any favors until much later in a painting. This is where also I realize that, oh crap, I left those purple lines in. That's not good. So I have to go in and paint over them with a full opacity brush just to get them out of there without ruining the work I've already done and don't flatten your image until you're really sure you like what you have, that's for sure. I then go in with a few different types of brushes to build up shadow and then highlights. I got so excited with the effect that the highlights were giving that I kind of forgot where the light would actually be on the figure, mostly on the face. You'll notice that the face has quite a few highlights that wouldn't necessarily be reaching it in the final composition, but it's not egregious. I also work a lot more with levels, using the levels tool and editing those on different color channels or, the lightness or saturation helps me edit things a lot faster. You'll also see me using the basic opacity round brush for the hair as well, and you might think, wow, that looks terrible, and it absolutely does, but later on, using some wet bristled brushes from Krita, I'm able to kind of create a natural hair look without much work at all. So I highly recommend that laying a good foundation with the basic brushes is critical for having a good sense of the value, where the light is hitting, and the general form of your object before you get into, oh, I need to draw every single hair strand. I also start adding clothes here because I definitely didn't want to commit to a naked figure at this point. I want sexy, not erotic or porny, so she gets a weird crop top and some bike shorts. I throw down some basic lines and then use a alpha clipping layer or whatever it is on Krita in order to just really quickly throw that down without having to worry too much about it. I also use levels to get a nice purplish color. It wasn't what I was originally intending. I wanted something blue, but the way that the purple came out looked really nice, and purple is my favorite color. So sometimes you just go with the, happy accidents, in the immortal words of Bob Ross. Next, I start experimenting with different composition elements. I think, a metal claw of some sort of robot or machinery would be really interesting here. So I pull out a stock photo of some metal crane from a construction Google image search and start drawing over it to get a general sense of how that would look. And looking back on it now, I don't think it was necessarily a bad choice. I just wasn't a huge fan of having a large metal object sticking up through her crotch being my focal point of the image. Then I try something that I have used in other pieces of mine, which is having poles or wires piercing the body, giving a sense of suspension in something. And while it's not bad, and I could have spent a little more time making it look better, I, again, didn't feel like that was quite right for this pose. And then as you can see, I finally settled on some wires. And as you'll later see, I then forget about them in the final piece and don't keep them at all. Here I'm using that wet brush that I mentioned in order to get a natural hair texture without doing really any work at all. I highly recommend you take plenty of time exploring the brushes of whatever software you're using. I found a lot of different brushes during this painting process and during others that I wouldn't necessarily have used for what I ended up using them for. After working on the hair for a little bit, cleaning up the edges, making it look nice, I then move on to the face, and oh, look at this tragedy. In the beginning, when I first started laying down shadows and highlights, it didn't look too bad, but the second I flipped over the canvas, I was just not impressed with myself. And so, of course, I start fiddling around, adding some darker lines, some better eyebrows, more highlights, which, of course, don't make any sense. I even kind of cover over the mouth and start thinking like, oh, the liquify tool will save me, but no, it did not. So instead, I decide to start sketching over it to start fresh with a new face. And in the end, I just decide to sketch totally fresh on a blank part of the canvas. And again, I'm not 100% convinced that this is the greatest face in the world, but once I put it over the painting, got it on there, moved it around a little bit with the transform tool, I was able to use it pretty well to get some sort of anatomy here that made a little bit more sense. And it took a few trial and error brush strokes. Again, I keep over-relying on liquify now that I've discovered that trick. It's really not going to help if the base anatomy is not where it should be. But then, finally, I get something that I'm starting to like. That shadowed upper lip and the shut eyes no longer look like creepy black holes or a dark mustache. I'm still having trouble with the nose, and here all I can say is trial and error. Maybe flip the canvas as I'm doing, or back away, start doing something else for a little bit, paint over it as I keep frequently doing, and starting fresh from a new perspective. But in the end, sometimes you're going to have to walk away from a particular part of your painting and just say, nope, I'm going to have to come back to this, which I eventually did. I also decide now I finally have to put something underneath the painting and give it an actual background, so I decide on a basic gray. And that's when I start cleaning up the lines, making sure that I don't have any stray brush marks, and in general, darkening up the shadows and adding a little bit more highlight. I also start defining the hands a little bit. Again, I am just kind of being lazy here and doing basic three-toned color palette of shadow, mid-tone, highlight, and I don't recommend this. I ended up having to go back and clean this up several times before I felt happy with it, and in the end, I forgot to do the bottom foot, and it stayed looking like a potato the entire time. If you put things off, you will forget them, and the project as a whole will suffer. After doing more detail work, picking up colors and spreading them around a little bit using wet brushes or what I believe was the, felt tip pen tool, I'm not sure, just kind of to smooth out some of my harder edges while leaving some harder edges where it would be appropriate. I crop, I get busy with some background strokes, and again, I was gonna do something cool, but I was exhausted. It was about 10 o'clock at night at this point, and I just couldn't be bothered after a full day of either drawing or working, and so I fudged around again with the transform tool, random strokes, the levels, and all of that, and I ended up with something I was moderately proud of. If you are changing your background in any significant way, it's important to check around your piece for stray marks because, as you can see, I had plenty of them, and they weren't very noticeable on a light background, so as the gradient progresses, they became more noticeable. I also added some highlights to the hair because it seemed very flat in the final piece. And as you can see, I did leave that brick foot there in the end, which is to my eternal shame. I could go back and fix it, but I had to make a video. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching the process of drawing a sexy girl doing nothing. I hope to draw many more of these and hopefully more interesting compositions in the future. I also hope you enjoyed watching my avatar speak for me in this little video. I think it will be an interesting experiment to see if it's worth the work or if it's just distracting while you're trying to pay attention to my process. So I'd love to hear your feedback on the avatar. Let me know in the comments, and in the end, have a good one.